What are the factors that shift the aggregate supply curve? Factors that cause the aggregate supply curve to shift are the ones that affect the cost of production. For example, number one, tightness of the labor market. Number second, expectations of inflation. Number third, workers attempt to push up their real wages. Number four, changes in the production costs that are unrelated to wages, for example, energy costs. These are the most important factors shifting the aggregate supply curve. But the first three factors shift the aggregate supply curve by affecting wage cost. However, the fourth factor affects other cost of production. Number one, tightness of the labor market. As our analysis of the approach to the long run equilibrium has shown us that when the labor market is tight, you know that when the labor market is tight, we can say that Y is greater than Yn. Look at here. Y is greater than Yn. This is an indication of the tightness of the labor market. So tightness of the labor market is the first and most important factor that shape the original position of the aggregate supply curve. And from the analysis, we can conclude that when the labor market is tight, wages and hence production cost rises. Wages and hence production cost rise. And when the labor market is slack, I mean to say that when Y is less than Yn, wages and production costs fall. When aggregate output is above the natural rate level, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. And when the aggregate output is below the natural rate level, the aggregate supply curve shift to the right. Look at here. Suppose if Y is greater than Yn, it means that the labor market is tight. What will happen? The aggregate supply curve will shift leftward from A is 1 to A is 2. But now look at here. When Y is less than Yn, we can say that the labor market is slack. The I is curve will shift rightward. The second important factor affecting the position of the aggregate supply curve is known as the expected price level. How this rise in expected price level will shift or will affect the position of the aggregate supply curve. So very simply, an increase in the expected price level leads to higher wages, which in turn raise the cost of production. It will lower the profit per unit of output at each price level and shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. Therefore, a rise in the expected price level causes the aggregate supply curve to shift to the left. But keep in mind that the greater the expected increase in the price level, the larger the shift. It means that if the expected increase in the price level is greater, or we can say that the higher the expected inflation, the larger the shift. The third important factor is known as wage push. How wage push, which is the most important factor that shift the aggregate supply curve. For example, there is a person and his fellows who are working in a construction industry. So suppose Chuck and his fellow construction workers decide to strike and succeed in obtaining higher real wages. This wage push will then raise the cost of production and the aggregate supply curve will shift leftward. So we can say that a successful wage push by workers will cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the left side. So the original aggregate supply curve will shift leftward to the new aggregate supply curve. So we will shift from A is 1 to A is 2 if the wage push is successful by workers. Changes in production costs. Changes in production costs unrelated to wages. For example, changes in technology. Changes in technology and in the supply of raw materials. These are known as supply shocks. Supply shocks. So we have two shocks. One is known as the positive supply shock, and the second one is known as the negative supply shock. So how the positive and negative supply shocks will affect the original position of the aggregate supply curve. So for example, changes in technology and the supply of raw materials can also shift the aggregate supply curve. Let me briefly explain the negative supply shock first. A negative supply shock, for example, a reduction in the availability of raw materials, for example, oil, will raise their price, increases production cost, and shift the aggregate supply curve leftward. So look at here. In the case of negative supply shock, the aggregate supply curve has shifted to the left side. Why this curve has shifted to the left side? If there is a reduction in the availability of raw materials, if the raw materials are available in a lesser quantity, for example, oil, what will happen? This will raise the price. It means that the production cost increases. If the production cost increases, it will shift the aggregate supply curve leftward. That's why we are shifting from A is 1 to A is 2 in the presence of a negative supply shock. Now, let me explain the positive supply shock. A positive supply shock, for example, good weather that leads to bountiful harvest and lowers the cost of food, will reduce the production cost and shift the aggregate supply curve to the right side. That's why we are shifting from A is 1 to A is 2. So let me conclude the whole discussion. So in one sentence, we can say that a negative supply shock that raises production cost shift the aggregate supply curve to the left, and a positive supply shock that lowers production costs shift the aggregate supply curve to the right side.